This is the kind of video where we get a little critical of Games Workshop. So if that's the kind of thing that turns you into a little green rage monster who leaves death threats down in the comments section, I've got a nice, totally unopinionated series coming out right now covering the core rules of Warhammer 40k. So you can go check that out, hit the subscribe button to get notified when the next parts of the series release, and let's move on to the video. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and this video might get a little rough. I'm recording from the road right now, and so I'm recording on a machine that is the technological equivalent of a rock stacked on top of a second rock. So this might be a little bit low effort. Today, we're going to be talking about the issues with the newly released 9th edition Ork Codex, and how this release has been, shall we say, not very good. We're in a weird period for 40k right now, with gathering restrictions finally lifting. People are getting excited to get back into in-person play, and events are kicking off in a big way for Warhammer, which makes it too bad that all those players are returning to one of the most broken and degenerate metagames that 40k has ever experienced. Games Workshop's track record since the beginning of 2021 has been pretty bad. Between non-existent balancing of its recent releases, the shameless cash grab of recent expansions, I'm looking directly at those Warzone books, abysmal QA throughout all of their recent releases with massive typos getting printed and reprinted over and over again, and all of this capped off by the cherry on top of outright lies and false advertising being fed to the community, especially with releases like their latest chapter approved. With general enthusiasm for the game sort of waning a little bit, these recent codexes have been Games Workshop's lifeline to show us that they can give us something different, a new and refreshing experience, maybe not a degenerate, broken, cash-grabby mess. So what did they give us? In our time of need, we got this frickin' Ork Codex. Let's talk about exactly what's wrong with the Codex. I'm not going to be doing an entire review of the whole book, and I will probably get to a top 5 or top 10 best units in the Codex once that gets a little bit worked out, but I think a lot of the answers are pretty obvious because there are some wildly divergent power levels between the units in this codex. What I do want to talk about today are just some of the ridiculous rules and design decisions that have been built into it that are just disastrous. So the codex is finally released. We're going to be going through a scanned copy of it today, so it is going to be a little hokey. I hope everyone bears with me as we look at, there's going to be some fingers in this one, I think, so I apologize for that. But let's talk about some of the ridiculous rules mistakes that Games Workshop has built into this Ork Codex. And this is one of the things that I was really excited to see if they would get better on. I mean, they've been making these huge mistakes, especially in their most recent releases, and have been getting called out for it. It's been really embarrassing. We've had, some ridiculous typos and rules issues come up. Things like the competitive edge Razor Flail Succubus and these wide open questions that they're printing in their rules. Hopefully the orcs could not have that, but unfortunately we do have a bunch of stuff in here that makes absolutely no sense. Now, for those who have been paying attention on the various 40k social medias, I think this particular loophole was the first one to jump out to a ton of people, and that is in the matched play section of the codex, or the chapter approved section of the codex here, where they talk about the new orc secondary objectives that are available to them. And this one right here, we want to talk about their Battlefield Supremacy secondary, Green Tide. Interestingly, orcs have 4 unique secondaries, which I don't know if I had noticed before. That should give them a lot of flexibility when it comes to picking secondary objectives, but what we want to talk about today is this Green Tide secondary, because Games Workshop's failure to template the rules are coming back again to bite them in the butt. We have just a ludicrously simplistic issue here, which is that this Green Tide secondary starts with directing the player who's picked that secondary to divide the battlefield into 4 even quarters. Now, there are a lot of table quarter scoring secondaries in 40k. That's not a new mechanic, but most of them so far have been out of the chapter approved books. And the chapter approved books do not include this clause right here to divide the battlefield into even quarters. Even secondaries like Necrons Purge the Vermin or Drukhari's Herd the Prey assume that the table quarters have already been defined, which is totally fair because the GT 2021 map layouts have table quarters defined in them. I don't believe it's ever actually stated that these are the table quarters that you're supposed to use, but the implication is there. However, Green Tide is different because it directs the player who's taking the objective to divide the battlefield as they see fit. Which means, as long as you have the requisite units, which are, Ork units with 11 or more models in them, you can make this absurdly easy, because all you need to do is draw yourself 4 table quarters that end, in your deployment zone. It seems to me the implication is that the table quarters are supposed to be even, meaning that they are consist of the same area and probably the same border, but you can do that easily by making triangles or making long rectangles on the table that allow you to score this secondary objective entirely from your own deployment zone without having to move at all. This directive to divide the battlefield is never in any other secondary objective. Why would you add this in this one particular secondary if it wasn't supposed to work differently than all of the other table quarter scoring secondaries? We also have the biggest and the best here, which is worded very poorly. It scores you 3 victory points at the end of each battle round for each of these things that you have achieved. It also says for a maximum of 5 victory points, but the way that that's worded seems like you can score 3 victory points each battle round to a maximum of 5, which means that you can only score it like 1 and 2/3 times before you're capped out. I don't think that's the way it's supposed to go. Now, in addition to just secondary objectives, there are some abilities that open up some big questions. The biggest one to me is this secondary objective here, Brutal but Cunning. This is literally just competitive edge from the Cult of Strife sub-faction supplement. Every time you make an attack, if the attack did not reach inflict damage, which means you either missed, you failed to wound, or your opponent saved that attack, if any of those occur, you make another attack at the end of your combat step. So you'll swing all your attacks. If any of them don't get through and deal damage, then you'll just pick those dice back up and try them again. The issue that we had with competitive edge was when you roll additional attacks out as a result of those initial sequence of attacks. While the same interaction that we had with competitive edge does not exist here, there is a very similar one, which is if you take the Goth's subfaction trait, which gives you exploding 6s in melee. Now, I'm not sure how the interaction of these two rules actually plays out. There may not be an interaction, to be perfectly fair, but the problem is that I have no idea. So the way the advanced rules treat attacks that roll multiple hit rolls is that if you are splitting your attack into several hit rolls, you treat each of those additional hit rolls as an additional attack. Now, it's unclear whether the same thing applies to attacks with exploding hits. And I think, the safest interpretation here is that they don't. So the issue would come up where if you have a Goth subculture and you have that competitive edge warlord trait, you roll a bunch of 6s to hit, those 6s explode, they then maybe don't reach the inflict damage step, and then do you pick those dice back up and attack with them again? If you do, then you'll need to keep track of which, if you're fast rolling, of which of your attacks was due to the explosions and which of your attacks were not, which is very cumbersome and annoying. But in addition, there's nothing to say that the additional attacks you make as a result of that competitive edge warlord trait does not then explode additional 6s. So you could potentially have, while not an exact copy of the competitive edge situation, you could have a very similar situation where your warlord rolls a bunch of attacks, those 6s explode, even if those explosions don't generate additional attacks, which I'm not 100% sure whether or not they're supposed to, then you will re-roll any of your attacks that failed, which can then explode again, which could, potentially be a sort of limited amount of exponential increase of your number of attacks. Obviously, this is not nearly as big of a problem as competitive edge was in Drukhari. For those who don't know, I did have a video on the competitive edge combo. It's been removed from the game. Now the competitive edge ability no longer splits its attacks a second time. So the way it works previously is that you would have a weapon that let you roll 2 attacks or 2 hit rolls for every 1 attack you made. So you would roll 2 hit rolls. If one of those didn't go through, you would then make an additional attack with a weapon, which is split it into 2 additional hit rolls. So you could potentially quadruple your attacks effectively between the weapon and then re-rolling and splitting the rerolls into. This is not the same situation. It's similar, but it's certainly not the same deal. But it's just weird that we have the situation that like isn't covered by the rules at all. I don't know how these competitive edge mechanics work alongside exploding hit rolls, but also that there would be such an issue with this warlord trait as it existed, and they would just go ahead and reprint it in the next book, which again does have a lot of extra sort of additional attack abilities. Now, speaking of characters, we also have some weird issues with characters and keywording. And this is just such a really obnoxious and annoying trend. So a lot of the characters have auras that affect themselves, right? Which Games Workshop can't decide whether or not it wants. For example, we have a war boss here, which gives +1 to hit to any clan core or clan character units within 6. If you have an aura ability, you're always considered to be in the range of your own aura ability. And since the war boss is going to share the clan keyword and he's a character model, then he will be giving himself +1 to hit. Now, that only really matters if he has something like a power claw, which subtracts 1 from his hit roll, which is kind of nice. It means that your war bosses will always cancel out their own hit penalty, which is pretty cool. But Games Workshop has gone to such lengths in every other faction to remove this interaction from the game and make characters not benefit themselves with their own aura, and then they totally turned it back for orcs. That said, we see it brought back in here with Captain Badrek, affecting only friendly Flash Kits units. They don't even have to be core, they don't even have to be characters, it's just all Flash Kits units within 6 inches. So we're just back to the 8th edition style aura wording, which is just kind of frustrating. Now, another weird interaction of keywording here and potentially miskeywording is Makari as well, who, in addition to being a character, is a Gretchen infantry. That makes Makari eligible to be targeted with Grot Shields, the stratagem, which has been reworked to now essentially make an Ork infantry unit untargetable as long as the Gretchen unit that you have elected to protect them with their Grot Shields is a closer visible target to the Ork unit. Now, there is a little bit of discussion happening right now around the community of whether or not that means that you can make the unit 100% untargetable. We can go ahead and find the Grot Shields stratagem up here real quick. Now, to my reading, it does not actually make the unit untargetable. The argument was that you could target Makari with the stratagem, have him protect an Ork unit within 6 inches, then character protect Makari with something else, so you have him within 3 inches of maybe the Ork unit that he's protecting, and then something else that's closer in front of him that's out of line of sight or something, so he can't be targeted, which then makes the Ork unit not targeted. It does say that the Gretchen infantry unit needs to be a closer visible target than the Ork infantry unit they're protecting, and because Lookout Sir removes you from being an eligible target, I believe that means that if Makari is Grot shielding and he does get Lookout Sir'd, then he would no longer be protecting the unit that he's Grot shielding for. That said, the issue does still arise because Makari has a 2+ rerollable and vulnerable save. So the dude's just got a shadow field that does not have the clause where you can't reroll for it. So there's going to be situations where this dude runs out in front of your army and, your opponent has relatively, maybe a relatively low volume of shooting, and they have to get through this 2+ invulnerable save. Now, he does lose it if he ever fails it, but again, it is not unrerollable, which means that he can probably tank an immense amount of damage before he goes down, which just feels like a misstep to me. Maybe it's fine, maybe having a 2+ invulnerable save protecting your Ork infantry units is okay, but seems like an oversight that Makari can protect like 30 Ork boys, and he just like waves the banner in front of him and blocks bullets and stuff. He's like a frickin' Jedi, man. I don't know. We also have another interaction that Games Workshop has tried so hard to remove from their game, and they just wrote right back in this Ork Codex. If we go down to some of the newest inclusions, the new Beast Snagas models, they're a whole can of worms. But their new vehicle, the Kill Rig, here it is, has this special snagged rule, where if it hits a non-Titanic vehicle or monster, the enemy model cannot finish any move more than 12 inches away from the kill rig until the start of the next orc turn. And that means that if you hit a non-hoverable flyer, it immediately dies for the most likely on the next turn. So basically, if the aircraft is angled away from the kill rig almost at all, it would then have to move its minimum 20 inches thanks to the airborne rule. And if it can't end that move within 12 inches of the kill rig thanks to its minimum movement, it will just straight up die. Now, this might not be the biggest deal because the Sticka Cannon, I mean, it's on a 5+ ballistic skill platform, so it's only hitting on a 6. It does reroll against vehicles, so it is a 1 in 3 chance to hit that airplane with the Sticka Cannon, and you also have to be a non-hoverable aircraft that is also angled in such a way where it's not going to be able to complete that move. But Games Workshop has tried so hard to remove these auto kill situations from the airborne rules, and they just added one back in. So it's really another example of kind of this degeneration of game design where Games Workshop has tried so hard over the evolution of 8th edition into 9th edition to prevent these mechanics from being created in their game, and then they just go ahead and go right back and do them right on over again. Now that's all of the major rules issues that I found in the Ork Codex. I'm sure there's more of them, but this is just the stuff that I picked out to my reading. But one thing I do want to talk about as well is just some game design philosophies that were implemented in this codex that I really don't agree with, and I do think that they are, at the very least, confusing and degenerative to the faction, but also probably depower orcs from, I think, where they could be or potentially where they should be, and make their game plan really silly and inconsistent. The first one is this new mechanic here, the DACA weapon mechanic. So for those who don't know, DACA weapons are a new type of weapon, as opposed to being, a heavy or rapid fire or assault or grenade, like all of the other weapons in the game are. Orcs now have access to this new DACA weapon type. This is almost exactly rapid fire with extra steps. Basically, the first value is the number of attacks you would get within your rapid fire range. The second value is the number of attacks you get normally. Looking at this at first glance, this is probably what rapid fire should have been. This seems a lot more intuitive and straightforward than the current rapid fire system, and it scales a little bit more appropriately than that one. But the other issue is that this is a big change from where a lot of orc... Now, the upside of this mechanic is that I do think it is kind of an interesting way to play orc shooting. It is trying to encourage the orc player to get in that close range without sort of really forcing your hand. So if you want to, you can sit back and shoot with your low DACA values, but you're incentivized to get up close and personal. The downside is that there's basically no support in this codex to allow the orc player to do that organically. The big issue with these DACA weapons is that they are not assault weapons. Almost every assault weapon in the codex that was in the 8th edition codex has moved to being a DACA weapon. There's a couple holdouts, but it's mostly stuff that's like blast weapons and some random vehicle weapons and things like that. These DACA weapons are not assault, and they have no, as far as I know, there might be something in here that I'm missing, they have no ability to advance and fire their guns. So it's this very aggressive faction that literally has an army-wide advance and charge that's trying to encourage you to run up the table and charge with your close combat models, but then also has stapled this weapon type onto almost every single weapon profile in the faction that then disallows you from shooting it if you advance. I think it seems to me like the speed wah ability that they have. So all of the orc war bosses, the various types of war bosses, can call a wah once per game. The standard war bosses can call a regular wah, and the speed bosses, which I think is like war trikes and bike bosses and stuff like that, can call a speed wah. Gazkul Thraka can call both of them. The regular wah allows you to advance and charge and gives you +1 to your attacks, and it gives you a +1 to your attacks the turn after you call it. The other one gives you an additional attack with your DACA weapons. It gets you some extra AP, and then the AP value sticks around. Now, there's this clause in here in the Speed Wa rule that allows you to fire your assault weapons without penalty the turn you advance, but almost every single weapon in this codex, see if we have a weapon chart here, is a Daka weapon. There are so few assaults, so we see a bunch of heavy, especially a lot of the larger guns are heavy, a bunch of Daka, and then a couple things are assault. We have some random sort of individual, like squig launches are assault weapons. Okay, cool. Or they automatically hit because they are flamers. So we have this ability that affects maybe a half dozen of appropriately sort of fieldable weapon profiles in the faction that allows them to advance and shoot their weapons without penalty, whereas every other weapon type doesn't benefit from this at all. And it's a weapon type that's trying to encourage you to get up close and personal without having the ability to allow you to do that more organically. So let's consider, right? You have a unit of Shuda boys, for example, with Daka weapons. Here's their Shuda. It did go up an attack if it's Dakaing, so if you're within 9 inches, it goes to 3 attacks, which is pretty cool. You now want to get within that 18 inches, or within that 9 inches to get the extra attack. So you're moving 5 inches up the table with your regular Ork boy movement every turn. An easier way to get up the table would be to use Gazgul Thraka to call, a standard Wa. That would allow you to advance and charge, and then also advancing would allow you to get closer to use your Daka weapons. However, if you advance with the Shuda boys, you can't shoot your Daka weapons, even though you could then charge. So, like, this classic Ork play pattern where you want to be advancing and charging, and you will accept the penalty to hit on the assault weapons because you had the old Daka rule, which could sort of mitigate that a little bit. Not really. It was actually really terrible and wasted a lot of time. I'm really glad we got rid of the old Daka rule. Just for the record, at least we have something that's a little bit more interesting. But it just works so anti-synergistically, and it's this huge kind of gear check when you try to conceptualize how the faction is going to play on the table, and you basically are dividing this Ork army into 2 separate types of units. Like, there's the shooty units who are going to be moving instead of advancing, and then there's the chargy units who are just going to be advancing and will never shoot their guns. And that just feels like such a mistake to me. I think I have an inkling that the clause that said that you don't suffer the move and fire penalty with your assault weapons was meant to say that you can't advance and fire with Daka weapons. I have a sneaking suspicion that's how that was supposed to work, because it doesn't make any sense the way it currently works. I guess it does buff thump guns, which a lot of the Beast Snaga stuff has, which brings me to my next criticism of the Codex, which is that the Beast Snaga profiles are sort of ridiculously hyper pushed. Or I guess not Beast Snagas in particular, but a lot of the profiles that you would never play in the previous version of the Codex have been super duper pushed. And while, the adage that Games Workshop always takes profiles that are bad and then buffs them in the next version so you have to rebuy your whole collection, that's kind of like the tinfoil hatty theory that everyone has every time this new codex comes out and really reinvigorates how the factions played and changes a lot of the power levels. And this one, it's super apparent. We were actually joking in the Discord server when the Ork Codex got spoiled that the Wreck-a-Trek Squig Buggy was going to be one of the best units in the game. And while, it's certainly not the best unit in the game compared to everything else, it is certainly one of the best units in the Codex. And just taking a unit that was in 8th edition, basically a worthless piece of garbage, and making it incredibly powerful was just so like blatantly a power creep. I think the other interesting comparison is between the kill rig, the new, is this chariot keyworded? No, it's just vehicle keyworded. Sure, why wouldn't it be chariot keyworded? The new vehicle for Beast Snagas particularly. And one thing that some community members pointed out to me was that the comparison between this thing and the existing battle wagon profiles. And so if we look up, it's just a couple pages up here. If we take a look at the battle wagons, and actually I'll go ahead and post a battle wagon data sheet next to the kill rig data sheet. But when you compare the two, it's like actually insane. For essentially the same cost and for an identical profile, the kill rig gets between 4 and 8 additional attacks at a much higher profile in melee. It also has better guns. It has an indirect fire weapon stapled to it automatically, as well as its other weapons. It has an auto-hitting las cannon that shoots between 1 and 3 times. It's a psyker that casts 2 powers. Like, what is this? It also, while it does have a smaller transport capacity, and the transport capacity is limited to beast snaggers, so it's not quite as good, it is open topped, so it's a much more effective transport than any of the other battle wagons are. And it's just such a direct comparison between these new rigs and the existing battle wagons. And these things come out so far ahead. It's just sort of gross to look at kind of how blatantly the profile's being pushed. And while I don't think that all of the beast snaggers releases in this codex are overpowered to that level, not even close. There's a lot of them that are mostly going to be dead on arrival, I think, unfortunately. Like, cavalry keyworded stuff in 40k right now is just super not very viable, and I think a lot of the cavalry are probably not going to be good, especially in comparison to some of the standard orc stuff that, again, was really bad and very, basically saw no play in the previous version of the codex, but now is going to be the greatest thing ever. Oh, cool. What a fun paradigm that is. That we're probably not going to see a lot of the new beast snagger stuff, but I do think some of it, and especially these rig profiles in particular, are just such a direct comparison to an existing profile. Then they're so much better. Now, in terms of an overall power level, I think orcs are probably going to be in a pretty good spot. A lot of the criticisms I have of the codex so far are almost entirely just mechanical. I'm not approaching it from a balance standpoint. I think the internal balance of the book is tilted directly on its head, and it's just a frustrating mess because there's a lot of garbage in here. But the stuff that's good is going to be good, and I think I have a feeling they're going to be somewhere around sort of the Death Guard Adeptus Sororitas level, where the real powerhouses of the faction aren't really quite apparent yet. And we're going to see, which of the new paradigms comes out on top and which one ends up being really good. Are Orc Boys still going to be effective at their new toughness 5, potentially with the snake bites buff to be very difficult to kill? I don't know. Maybe we see Warbiker spam. Maybe we see like artillery spam with squig buggies and these kill rigs and stuff like that. I don't know the direction that the codex is going to go in, but I do think it has a couple viable directions. I am a little bit worried that it's kind of fitting into the paradigm that not all of, but most of the codexes in 9th edition have been so far, which is that they can deliver sort of a blistering amount of damage on turn 1 and really rinse people down if they end up going first. And, part of that is that the orc aircraft may be very good. A lot of the faster stuff is going to be very powerful. For good or ill, I think that's sort of just how a lot of the codexes are going, and that's just how, ranged armies go. As much as orc players might not like it, the army is very much kind of a mid-range style army where a lot of the units are dedicated shooting units. You might have a couple very dedicated melee units or units that can do both, but there's going to be a lot of DACA in there. Anyway, that's a very long diatribe about orcs. I hope everybody enjoyed the video. I'm sorry that it was a little bit of a bummer, but I did feel like I had to say my piece on this one because this codex is a mess. Anyway, remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.